The melody, faint at first, snaked its way into Arthur Sterling's consciousness, and he froze. It was Cecilia's music, the very tune his wife, Cecilia Hayes, had played endlessly before vanishing 2 decades prior. From his leather chair in his office high within a gleaming San Francisco tower, Arthur stared through windows blurred by a persistent drizzle. Below, the city pulsed with its familiar chaotic energy, yet for Arthur, there was only a profound silence, a silence that underscored the vast emptiness his life had become. 20 years. 20 years since Cecilia disappeared, and despite the towering success that had followed, nothing had ever mended the void she left. For Arthur, everything inevitably circled back to that single, haunting image: Cecilia at the grand piano in their Pacific Heights home, her fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys, coaxing out that same soft, melancholic melody over and over. A tune so intimate, so uniquely hers, it felt like a secret language between them. Then one day she was simply gone. No word, no trace. Since that moment, Arthur's existence had been defined by his relentless work, his sprawling fortune, and an unshakable isolation. On this particular rain-swept afternoon, Arthur found himself conducting a personal inspection of the Fairmont, one of his flagship luxury hotels on Nob Hill. He had always preferred a hands-on approach. It offered a semblance of control, something he'd desperately craved since his world shattered. As he moved through the opulent grand lobby, his footsteps resonated against the polished marble, staff members standing in quiet, almost reverent deference as he passed. They were accustomed to his presence, to the man who owned more properties than most could comprehend but seemed to derive no joy from any of them. He was midway through his methodical walk when a sound arrested him. His heart stuttered. A faint, achingly familiar sound drifted through the air. Piano notes, soft and ethereal, emanating from somewhere deep within the hotel's core. But it wasn't just any song. It was her song. Celia's song. The same haunting melody she used to play each evening before she vanished. Arthur's pulse hammered. For a disorienting moment, he wondered if his sanity was fraying. After all, 2 decades had passed. But the music was undeniable. Driven by an irresistible deep-seated compulsion, he followed the sound down a narrow carpeted corridor, past the elegant dining hall, and towards the hotel's service wing. Turning a corner, he found himself in a small, utilitarian kitchen where staff sometimes gathered during breaks. And there, seated at a worn, upright piano tucked in a corner, was a young woman. She looked up, startled, as Arthur entered. The music ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. She was dressed in the simple dark uniform of the hotel's cleaning crew, her dark hair pulled back into a slightly disheveled ponytail, her hands resting awkwardly on the piano keys, as if caught between continuing or fleeing. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice a mere whisper. "I didn't think anyone was here." Arthur didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind, struggling to process what he'd just experienced. It was impossible. How could she know that song? The melody had been a private treasure, known only to Cecilia, a deeply personal piece shared between them. Yet here was this young woman, a complete stranger, playing it flawlessly, note for note. "Where did you learn that?" Arthur finally asked, his voice quiet but edged with an undeniable firmness. The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking to the keys before meeting his again. I don't really know. My mother used to play it when I was little, but I don't remember much about her. She left me at an orphanage when I was a baby." Arthur's heart clenched. An orphan. The mystery surrounding her deepened, yet it made no sense. This song wasn't well known. It wasn't something one would hear casually, let alone from someone who grew up in the Bay Area children's haven. The more he pondered, the more questions swarmed his mind. "What's your name?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he tried to reconcile the bizarre coincidence. "Olivia," she replied, her voice still soft, almost timid. "Olivia Dawson." Olivia. A name as simple as it was common. And yet, there was something about her, an elusive familiarity in her features. Her eyes, perhaps, or the way she held herself. Arthur found himself staring, trying to pinpoint what it was about her that tugged at a distant memory. "And your mother, she never told you anything about where you came from?" he pressed, feeling a strange, urgent pull to know more. Olivia shook her head. "No. She left when I was too young to remember much. Just the music. That's all I really have from her." Arthur's mind raced. It was impossible, wasn't it? Cecilia had vanished without a trace. He'd searched for her for years, pouring resources into the effort, until finally, he'd been forced to accept she was gone, probably dead. And yet, here was this young woman playing Cecilia's song, a woman with no apparent family, no past and no answers. Something about this felt too precise, too resonant. Arthur didn't believe in coincidences, and this was far from a coincidence. But what did it signify? Was this young woman somehow connected to Cecilia? Could she be the key to finally unlocking the mystery of what happened all those years ago? Without another word, Arthur turned and left the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The rhythmic drumming of the San Francisco rain against the windows was drowned out by the questions swirling in his mind. He knew deep down that this was only the beginning, and whatever answers awaited him, they wouldn't be easy to face. Arthur's thoughts lingered on the conversation with Olivia long after he left the Fairmont. He found himself pacing his penthouse apartment overlooking the glittering bay, the same questions replaying in an endless loop. How had she learned that song? The mere thought of Cecilia's melody unleashed a torrent of emotions. Sadness, confusion, and strangely a sliver of hope. For 20 years there had been nothing. No clues, no signs, just an aching void. But now this song had resurfaced, stirring memories Arthur had long tried to suppress. He stood at the expansive window, staring out at the San Francisco skyline, the rain having slowed to a fine drizzle, city lights shimmering in the mist. The last time he'd felt this restless was in the raw, early days after Cecilia had disappeared. Back then, he'd spent sleepless nights consumed with wondering where she was, what had befallen her. He'd hired private investigators, scoured every corner of the city, even pursued a few tantalizingly false leads. But eventually, the trail had grown cold, and with it, any tangible hope of finding her. But now, could it be that Olivia was connected to Cecilia in some profound way? It felt preposterous even to think it, yet something in his gut told him this was more than mere chance. He needed answers. He needed to know more about this girl and her past. That night, Arthur made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Gus Mac Riley, an old-school private investigator he'd worked with during the initial search for Cecilia. Mac was known for unearthing the kinds of secrets people desperately wanted to keep buried. "Sterling," Mac's gruff voice greeted him. "It's been a while. Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I need your help," Arthur said, dispensing with pleasantries. "There's someone I need you to look into. Her name's Olivia Dawson. She works at the Fairmont, one of my hotels. I need to know everything about her. Where she came from, her family, everything." Mac was silent for a moment. "Olivia, huh? What's this about?" "I'm not sure yet," Arthur admitted, "but I think she might be connected to Cecilia." Mac let out a low whistle. "Still chasing that ghost, huh, Sterling?" Arthur clenched his jaw. "Just do the job, Mac. I'll send you the details. I need answers as soon as possible." All right. I'll get on it," Mac replied. "I'll call you when I have something." After hanging up, Arthur couldn't suppress a flicker of hope. Maybe this time he would finally find some clarity. Maybe this time, the answers he'd been seeking for 2 decades would finally emerge. The next day, Arthur couldn't resist the urge to visit the Fairmont again. He told himself it was for business, but deep down, he knew the real reason. As he made his way through the lobby, he spotted Olivia cleaning near the grand entrance. She looked up and saw him, her expression a mixture of surprise and nervousness. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him politely. "Can I help you with something?" Arthur hesitated. He hadn't planned on speaking to her, but now that she was in front of him, the questions resurfaced. You mentioned your mother used to play that song, he began, keeping his tone casual. Do you remember anything else about her? Olivia paused, as if searching for memories that were long faded. Not really, she said after a moment. I was really young when she left. All I have are bits and pieces. Sometimes I wonder if the things I remember are even real. Arthur nodded, understanding the frustration of chasing memories that felt more like dreams. What about the song? Did she ever say where she learned it? Olivia shook her head. No, it was just something she always played. I didn't think much of it. Do you have anything of hers? Photos? Letters? Arthur asked, pushing gently, though careful not to sound too intrusive. No, Olivia said quietly. When she left me at the Bay Area Children's Haven, she didn't leave anything behind. That familiar pang of sorrow hit Arthur again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Sympathy. He could see the pain in Olivia's eyes, the same loneliness that had haunted him for 2 decades. He wanted to help her, but more than that, he needed to understand why this girl, this stranger, was so deeply tied to the memories of the woman he had lost. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and frustration for Arthur. He kept busy with meetings and business affairs, but his mind was always on Olivia and the mystery surrounding her. Every time he thought about that song, something gnawed at him, a sense that the past was creeping back in ways he hadn't anticipated. He spent hours replaying his last conversation with her, trying to make sense of the connection, trying to remember any details from Cecilia's disappearance that might help him. Finally, late one evening, the call came. Arthur had been waiting, pacing his penthouse like a caged lion, and when the phone rang, his heart raced. Sterling. Mac's voice crackled through the line. I've got some information for you. You're not going to believe this. Arthur immediately straightened, gripping the phone tighter. What did you find? I looked into that girl, Olivia Dawson, Mac began, his tone serious. She's got no family, just like she said. Records show she was left at an orphanage, Bay Area Children's Haven, when she was just a baby. No name, no nothing. But here's where it gets interesting. The orphanage she was dropped off at. It's the same one you and I checked out years ago when we were looking into Cecilia. Arthur's blood ran cold. He remembered that orphanage all too well. It had been one of the dead ends in his search for Cecilia, a lead that had gone nowhere. Till now. You're sure? Arthur asked, his voice tense. Positive, Mac replied. I double-checked everything. The timeline lines up too. Olivia was dropped off there about a year after Cecilia disappeared. Arthur could hardly breathe, his mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. Olivia's age, her being abandoned at the same orphanage. It all pointed to one terrifying, exhilarating possibility. And there's more, Mac continued, his voice lowering. I talked to a few people who used to work there back then. No one remembers who dropped her off. But there was something strange about the whole situation. No one came back for her, no one asked questions. It was like she was just forgotten. Arthur stood in silence, staring out at the city lights shimmering over the bay. Forgotten. Just like Cecilia had been. His mind reeled with the implications. Was it possible that Olivia was connected to Cecilia in more ways than one? Could she be their daughter? Sterling, you still there? Mac asked, his voice pulling Arthur from his thoughts. Yeah, Arthur said, his voice hoarse. I'm here. Look, I know this is a lot to take in, Mac continued, but I think you need to dig deeper. There's something here, Sterling. Something big. You're not dealing with a coincidence. If you want, I can keep looking. Arthur paused for a moment, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to say no, to stop this now before he uncovered something too painful to handle. But another part of him, the part that had never stopped hoping for answers, knew he had to keep going. Yeah, Arthur said finally, his voice steadying. Keep digging. I need to know everything. After he hung up, Arthur sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. If Olivia was his daughter, it meant that Cecilia had been pregnant when she disappeared. Something he had never known, never even suspected. It also meant that whoever had taken Cecilia had taken his child too. The thought sent a chill through him. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Cecilia had vanished without a trace, and all these years, he had believed she was gone. But now there was this possibility, this terrifying possibility, that she had been alive, that she had given birth, and that their child had been left in an orphanage to fend for herself. The next day, Arthur returned to the Fairmont. His emotions a storm brewing beneath his composed surface. He spotted Olivia cleaning near the lobby, and despite everything swirling in his mind, he knew he had to approach her carefully. He had no proof yet, no certainty, only suspicions. But he had to know more. "Olivia," Arthur called as he approached her. She turned, looking surprised to see him again. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right?" "I need to ask you something," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "About your past. I know you said you don't remember much, but did you ever hear anything about where you came from? Anything at all?" Olivia frowned, thinking hard. "Not really. The orphanage didn't have any records about me. All I know is that I was left there when I was a baby." "Why are you asking?" Arthur hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's just, I think there's more to your past than you realize. I've been looking into it, and I found out that you were dropped off at an orphanage that I'm familiar with." Olivia looked confused. "Familiar with? How?" Arthur took a deep breath. "It's the same place I searched years ago when I was looking for my wife. She disappeared about 20 years ago, around the same time you were left there." Olivia blinked, clearly taken aback by the connection. You think your wife might have had something to do with me being there?" "I don't know yet," Arthur admitted, "but the timeline adds up. And the song you played on the piano, it's the same one she used to play." Olivia stared at him, her face pale as she processed his words. "But that doesn't make sense. I don't remember anything about your wife. Or about any of this." "I know," Arthur said softly, "but I think we need to find out. There's something here, Olivia. Something big. And I think it's connected to both of us." Olivia stood there in stunned silence, her mind clearly racing with the implications of what Arthur had just said. Finally she nodded, a look of determination crossing her face. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's find out the truth." In the days that followed their conversation, the weight of Arthur's suspicions grew heavier. He couldn't shake the idea that Olivia was more than just a random girl with a mysterious past. There was too much pointing toward a deeper connection, too many coincidences to ignore. He found himself constantly revisiting the past, memories of Cecilia flooding back with a new sense of urgency. What if she had been taken from him not just as his wife, but as a mother too? The thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Despite the storm of emotions brewing inside, Arthur did his best to keep up appearances. He continued to run his empire with the same cold efficiency that had earned him his fortune. But inside he was unraveling. Every moment he wasn't working, he was thinking about Olivia, about the possibility that she was his daughter, and what that meant for everything he thought he knew about his life. One afternoon, as Arthur sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mac. "Got something you should see. Meet me at your place tonight. 7 p.m. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what Mac had uncovered, but the message sent a jolt of both excitement and dread through him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever new piece of the puzzle Mac had found, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. That evening, Mac arrived at Arthur's penthouse carrying a small manila folder. His expression was serious, more so than usual, and Arthur knew immediately that whatever was inside that folder was important. "I dug a little deeper like you asked," Mac said, setting the folder on the table. And I found something you're going to want to see. Arthur took the folder, his hands feeling unsteady. He opened it to find a few grainy photos, old documents, and a handwritten letter. As he flipped through the pages, one thing caught his eye: a birth certificate. His heart pounded as he looked closer, reading the details. The certificate was for a baby girl, born approximately 9 months after Cecilia's disappearance. The mother's name was listed as Cecilia Hayes. Arthur stared at the paper, his vision blurring as the reality of what he was holding sank in. Cecilia had given birth. Olivia wasn't just connected to his wife. She was their daughter. The girl standing in front of that piano, playing Cecilia's song, was his own flesh and blood. He looked up at Mac, his voice hoarse. "How did you find this?" "It wasn't easy," Mac admitted, sitting down across from him. "I had to pull a lot of strings, call in some favors. But I tracked down UCSF Medical Center where she was born. The problem is, after Olivia was born, Cecilia disappeared again. No one knows what happened to her after that." Arthur felt like the ground was falling out from beneath him. "So Cecilia, she was alive long enough to have the baby?" "Yeah," Max said quietly. "But after that she vanished. No death certificate, no trace. It's like she just disappeared." Arthur's mind raced. For years, he had believed Cecilia was gone, dead even. But now he knew she had survived long enough to give birth to their daughter. What happened after that was still a mystery, but this new piece of information changed everything. "Olivia doesn't know, does she?" Mac asked, watching Arthur carefully. "No," Arthur replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has no idea. You going to tell her?" Arthur hesitated. He didn't know how to break this kind of news to someone, especially someone like Olivia, who had grown up without any family, without knowing who she truly was. How could he possibly explain to her that not only was her mother someone she never knew, but her father had been right in front of her this whole time? "I have to," Arthur finally said. "She deserves to know the truth." Mac nodded. "Just be careful, Sterling. This kind of thing, it's not easy for anyone to handle." After Mac left, Arthur sat alone with the birth certificate in his hands, the weight of it pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. Cecilia had been alive. Olivia was their daughter. And now, it was up to him to figure out what happened to the woman he had loved, and how to make things right with the daughter he never knew he had. Arthur spent the next few days grappling with the enormity of what he had learned. Cecilia had been alive, and Olivia, this girl who had unknowingly stumbled into his life, was their daughter. The revelation sent his mind spinning in 1,000 directions, but the most pressing question remained: what had happened to Cecilia after Olivia was born? Why had she disappeared without a trace? And most terrifyingly, who had taken her in the first place? He needed answers, but first, he needed to tell Olivia the truth. Arthur wasn't sure how she would react, but he knew this wasn't something he could keep from her. She deserved to know who she was, and more importantly, she deserved to know who her mother was. It was a rainy afternoon when Arthur finally gathered the courage to approach Olivia. She was working as usual, cleaning in the lobby of the Fairmont, when Arthur walked in. He stood there for a moment, watching her from a distance, trying to figure out how to start the conversation. She had no idea how much her life was about to change. "Olivia," he called softly, stepping toward her. She looked up from her work, surprised to see him again. "Mr. Sterling. Hi. Can we talk for a minute? Somewhere private?" Arthur asked, his tone gentle but serious. Olivia looked puzzled but nodded. "Sure, I guess." They moved to a quiet corner of the hotel, a small lounge that was empty in the mid-afternoon. Arthur gestured for her to sit, and for a moment they both sat in silence. The weight of what he was about to tell her seemed too heavy for words, but he knew he had to start somewhere. "I found something," Arthur began, his voice soft but firm. "Something about your past. And about my past too." Olivia's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Arthur hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. Olivia, I've been looking into your background trying to find out more about where you came from. And I found some answers. Olivia shifted in her seat, clearly unsettled by his words. What kind of answers? About your mother, Arthur said, his eyes locking with hers. And about who she was. Olivia froze, her expression tightening. What do you know about my mother? Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the birth certificate Mac had given him. He handed it to Olivia, watching as her eyes scanned the document. First she looked confused. Then her eyes widened as she processed what she was reading. Cecilia Hayes, Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. That's your wife's name. Arthur nodded slowly. She's also your mother. Olivia stared at him, disbelief etched on her face. That can't be right. There's no way. I know it's hard to believe, Arthur said softly, but it's the truth. After you were born, your mother disappeared, just like she did from my life. We both lost her, Olivia. I've been searching for answers about what happened to her ever since. Olivia's hands shook as she held the birth certificate. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. So you're saying that you're my father? Arthur nodded, the words catching in his throat. Yes, I'm your father. For a long moment, Olivia sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the revelation. She had spent her entire life wondering who she was, where she had come from. And now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. The man sitting in front of her wasn't just her boss. He was her father. The weight of it felt overwhelming. But why didn't I know? Olivia finally asked, her voice cracking. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't you find me sooner? Arthur sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't know you existed. When Cecilia disappeared, I had no idea she was pregnant. I thought she was gone for good. It's only recently that I started digging into your past and realized the truth. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, clearly struggling to keep her emotions in check. So my whole life, I've been alone. And I didn't have to be. Arthur's heart broke at her words. He wanted to reach out to her to comfort her, but he wasn't sure if she would accept it. He had never been a father, and now he was faced with the reality that he had a daughter he never knew. I'm sorry, Arthur said quietly. I wish I had known sooner. I would have come for you. I would have made sure you were never alone. Olivia looked down at the birth certificate again, her tears falling onto the paper. She didn't say anything for a long time, and Arthur wasn't sure what else he could say. The truth was out, but it had opened up a new world of questions. Questions that neither of them had answers to yet. Finally Olivia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to her? To Cecilia? Arthur shook his head. I don't know. That's what I've been trying to figure out. All I know is that she was alive long enough to give birth to you. After that, she vanished again. Olivia wiped her eyes, looking up at Arthur with a mixture of sadness and determination. We need to find her. Arthur nodded. We will. I promise you we'll find out about what happened to her. In that moment, there was a silent understanding between them. They were no longer strangers bound by a simple melody. They were father and daughter, united in their search for the truth about the woman who had been taken from both of them. The days following Arthur's revelation were filled with an uncomfortable quiet between him and Olivia. The weight of the truth seemed to hang in the air, neither of them knowing exactly how to move forward from this newfound relationship. Arthur, always a man of action, was unsure how to handle the emotional complexity of being a father to a woman he had never known. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed lost in a sea of emotions. Confusion, anger, and a deep yearning for answers about her mother. Determined not to let the silence stretch on, Arthur returned to what he knew best: action. He poured his resources into uncovering more about Cecilia's fate. With Max still working on the case, Arthur felt he was getting closer to the answer he had been searching for all these years. But the urgency was even greater now. He wasn't just looking for closure. He was looking for Cecilia for Olivia's sake too. She deserved to know her mother. One evening, as the San Francisco fog rolled in, pattering against the windows of his penthouse, Arthur received another call from Mac. "I found something," Mac said, his voice more serious than usual. Arthur immediately sat up, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "I've been digging into the records from around the time Olivia was born. There's a detail I missed earlier, but it's important," Mac explained. "There was a witness. Someone who claimed to have seen Cecilia after she gave birth." Arthur's heart raced. "Who? Where can I find them?" "Not so fast," Mac cautioned. "The witness is an old woman now. Her name is Eleanor Vance. She was a nurse at UCSF Medical Center where Cecilia gave birth. She doesn't remember much. Years have passed, but she told me something strange. After Olivia was born, she overheard a conversation between two men. They were discussing Cecilia, and it sounded like they were planning to move her somewhere, against her will." Arthur's hand tightened around the phone. "Where did they take her?" "That's the problem," Max said, frustration clear in his voice. "Eleanor doesn't know. She wasn't involved in anything beyond that overheard conversation. But it's a lead. It means Cecilia didn't just vanish on her own. Someone took her." Arthur's mind spun. Someone had taken Cecilia. Again. It was almost too much to bear. After all these years, she hadn't left of her own free will. She had been taken. And if that was true, then there was a chance she was still alive. "Do you have any idea who these men were?" Arthur asked, his voice low and controlled. "I'm working on it," Mac replied. "But if what Eleanor heard is true, we're dealing with something bigger than just a kidnapping. This wasn't random. These men had a purpose." Arthur's jaw clenched. The idea that someone had orchestrated this, had taken Cecilia and kept her away all these years, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in a long time. But more than that, it filled him with determination. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't going to let Cecilia stay lost. "Keep digging," Arthur said, his voice hard. "I want to know everything." Later that night, Arthur sat down with Olivia to tell her what Mac had uncovered. She had been keeping to herself more than usual, processing everything in her own quiet way. But when Arthur told her about the nurse and the conversation she overheard, something in Olivia's expression changed. "So they took her?" Olivia asked, her voice shaky. "She didn't just leave me." Arthur nodded. "It looks that way. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're getting closer." Olivia was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Then she looked at Arthur, and the vulnerability in her gaze caught him off guard. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was abandoned. I thought maybe she didn't want me. But if she was taken..." "She wanted you," Arthur said firmly. "She was taken before she had the chance to protect you." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Arthur thought she might pull away again, retreating into the emotional walls she had built around herself. But instead she surprised him. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I want to find her. Whatever it takes." Arthur felt a surge of pride. Despite everything she had been through, despite the pain and confusion of learning who she really was, Olivia was strong. Stronger than he had realized. "We'll find her," Arthur promised. Together. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Mac continued to dig into the mystery, trying to track down anyone who might have been involved in Cecilia's disappearance. Meanwhile, Arthur and Olivia began working together to piece together what they knew. The bond between them grew as they spent more time together, united by their shared mission. Arthur found himself opening up to Olivia in ways he hadn't expected, and she, in turn, began to trust him more. It wasn't an easy transition. There were still moments of tension, moments when the reality of their relationship felt too strange, too sudden. But they were getting through it together. One evening, as they sat in Arthur's penthouse, surrounded by documents and old photos of Cecilia, Arthur looked over at Olivia and realized just how much she had changed his life in such a short time. She had brought hope back into his world, a world that had been so dark for so long. And now, with her by his side, he felt like they might actually have a chance to find Cecilia to bring her home. But even as hope filled him, a dark thought lingered in the back of Arthur's mind. If they were getting closer to the truth, how long before those who had taken Cecilia realized they were being hunted? The tension was palpable as Arthur and Olivia continued their search for Cecilia. They had found more pieces of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Every new discovery brought more questions, and as the days passed, the looming threat of the unknown grew. Arthur could sense it. The feeling that they were being watched, that whoever had taken Cecilia all those years ago was aware of their investigation. Olivia, for her part, seemed to have found a new sense of purpose in the search for her mother. She had thrown herself into it with a determination that surprised Arthur. They spent hours going over old documents, tracking down anyone who might have known something about Cecilia's disappearance. But despite their best efforts, they still hadn't found the crucial piece of information that would lead them directly to her. It was late one evening when Mac called again. Arthur answered immediately, his heart racing as he heard the familiar voice on the other end. "I've got something big," Mac said, his tone urgent. "I've been following up on that lead, the one about the men who took Cecilia. Turns out they were working for someone." Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. "Who?" "That's the thing," Mac continued. "It's someone from your past, Sterling. Someone with a grudge. His name is Julian Thorne." The name hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. Julian Thorne. A name he hadn't heard in years, but one he hadn't forgotten. Thorne had been a business rival of Arthur's years ago, a man who had tried to take over Arthur's real estate empire in a hostile bid. When Arthur had outmaneuvered him, Thorne had sworn revenge. But Arthur had assumed the threats were nothing more than empty words. Now, it seemed Thorne had made good on that promise. "Thorne," Arthur repeated, his voice cold. "He's behind this." Mac's voice was grim. "Looks like it. He hired the men who took Cecilia. From what I've been able to piece together, Thorne wanted to hit you where it hurt the most, your family. He had her taken, and when he found out she was pregnant, he had her kept away. He made sure you never found out about Olivia." Arthur felt a surge of rage, his hands trembling as he held the phone. Thorne had orchestrated everything. The years of pain, the loneliness, the guilt. Thorne had been behind it all. And now, after all this time, Arthur finally had a name to put to the face of the man who had stolen his life from him. "Where is he?" Arthur demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm working on it," Mac replied. "He's been keeping a low profile, but I've got a lead on one of his associates. I think we can track him down. But Sterling, this guy is dangerous. If you go after him, you need to be ready for what comes next." "I've been ready for 20 years, Arthur said, his voice hard. "I'm not stopping now." After hanging up, Arthur sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process the information. Julian Thorne. The man who had taken everything from him was still out there, still pulling the strings. And now that Arthur knew the truth, he wasn't going to rest until Thorne paid for what he had done. But as his mind raced with thoughts of revenge, Arthur also knew he had to be careful. Thorne wasn't just a petty criminal. He was powerful, connected, and dangerous. If they were going to confront him, they needed to be smart about it. That evening, Arthur sat down with Olivia to tell her everything. She had a right to know who had taken her mother, who had stolen the life they were meant to have. When he told her the name, Olivia's face went pale. "Julian Thorne," she repeated, her voice shaky. "Why would he do this?" Arthur explained the history between him and Thorne, how their rivalry had turned bitter when Arthur had won a major deal that Thorne had been after. It had been a long time ago, but for someone like Thorne, a man with a fragile ego and a thirst for power, it had been enough to fuel a vendetta that spanned decades. Olivia sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation. So all of this, everything that happened to Mom, to me, it was all because of some business deal? Arthur nodded, his expression grim. Thorne wanted to hurt me. And he did. Olivia shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. How could someone be that cruel? How could he do this to us? Arthur didn't have an answer. He had spent years asking himself the same questions, wondering how anyone could be capable of such cruelty. But now wasn't the time for questions. Now was the time for action. We're going to find him, Arthur said, his voice firm. And we're going to make him pay for what he's done. Olivia looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. But what if he comes after us? If he's still out there, he could try to stop us. Arthur reached out and took her hand, his grip steady. I won't let him hurt you, Olivia. Not again. This time we're going to end this. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Arthur worked closely with Mac, tracking down Thorne's associates and following every lead they could find. They uncovered a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what Arthur had imagined, with Thorne at the center of it all. It was clear that confronting him wouldn't be easy, but Arthur didn't care. He was ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the tension between Arthur and Olivia began to ease. They had found a common purpose in their search for Cecilia, and it had brought them closer. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when the reality of their new relationship felt overwhelming, but they were learning to navigate it together. And as they closed in on Thorne, Arthur felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The end was in sight. The man who had taken everything from him was within reach, and soon Arthur would have his chance to make things right. But even as he prepared for the confrontation ahead, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him, Thorne wouldn't go down without a fight. And the closer they got to him, the more dangerous things would become. The anticipation of what was to come weighed heavily on Arthur. The revelation that Julian Thorne was behind Cecilia's disappearance was more than just a discovery. It was a call to action. For years, Arthur had lived with the unresolved pain of losing his wife, and now he was faced with a chance to not only find her but also confront the man responsible for their suffering. Olivia had grown quieter since learning the truth. She still showed the same determination to find her mother, but something had shifted. Arthur could see the turmoil in her eyes, the weight of her identity, the sudden reality of having a father, and the brutal truth of who had taken her family from her. Despite her strength, Arthur worried about how she would handle the confrontation with Thorne, knowing how deeply personal this had become for both of them. One evening, as they sat in Arthur's penthouse, poring over maps and information about Thorne's whereabouts, possibly a remote cabin in the Redwood forests north of the city, Olivia suddenly broke the silence. I still can't wrap my head around it, she said, her voice barely audible. All these years I thought I was abandoned. I thought maybe my mother didn't want me. But to know she was taken, that she didn't have a choice. Arthur looked up from the papers spread across the table. I know it's a lot to process, he said gently. But you have to remember, none of this was your fault. Your mother loved you. She fought for you. Olivia stared down at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the maps absently. But why didn't anyone come for me? Why didn't you know? The question cut Arthur deeply. He had asked himself the same thing over and over in the past few days. How had he missed the signs? How had he not known that Cecilia had been alive long enough to give birth to Olivia? It was a question that haunted him. I didn't know she was pregnant when she disappeared, Arthur admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't even know there was a child to look for. If I had known. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If Arthur had known, nothing would have stopped him from finding Olivia, from rescuing her from a life of uncertainty and loneliness. The guilt of not knowing gnawed at him every day. Olivia was silent for a moment, then she spoke again, her voice more steady this time. I don't blame you. I don't know if I ever could. But I can't help feeling like my whole life has been a lie. Arthur swallowed hard. I understand how you feel. You do. But we can change that now. We can find her. And we can stop Thorne from doing this to anyone else. Olivia looked up at him, and for the first time since they had started this journey, Arthur saw something new in her eyes. A glimmer of hope. It was faint, but it was there. She had spent her whole life feeling lost, adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. But now there was a sense of direction, a purpose that tied her to something larger than herself. "We'll find her," Olivia said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And when we do, I want her to know that she wasn't alone. That I never gave up on her." Arthur's chest tightened with emotion. He reached across the table and placed his hand over Olivia's. "She'll know, Olivia. I promise you she'll know." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Mac had managed to track down an associate of Thorne's, a man named Sal Sly Marino, who had been involved in some of the darker aspects of Thorne's operations. Mac arranged a meeting with him, hoping to extract information about Cecilia's whereabouts. The meeting was set in a quiet, secluded dive bar in the Mission District. Arthur and Olivia arrived early, the tension between them palpable as they waited for Sal to show up. Mac had warned them that this man wasn't to be trusted, but he was their best lead. When Sal Marino finally walked in, he looked every bit the part of someone who had spent his life on the wrong side of the law. He was wiry, with a face marked by years of hard living, his eyes constantly shifting as if he were always on the lookout for trouble. He slid into the booth across from Arthur and Olivia without a word, his gaze flickering between them. "You're the ones looking for Thorne," Sal said, his voice low and gravelly. "Mac tells me you're willing to pay for information." Arthur didn't flinch. "I'm willing to pay for the truth." Sal smirked, but there was no warmth in it. "Truth doesn't come cheap." Arthur leaned forward, his voice cold. "Neither does betrayal. But I'm sure you know that already." Sal's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Sterling. You're playing in dangerous territory. Thorne doesn't like people poking around his business." Arthur held his gaze, unflinching. "He took my wife. He took my daughter. This stopped being just business a long time ago." Sal shifted uncomfortably, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Thorne has her. I don't know where, but I know she's alive. He's been keeping her somewhere off the grid, far away from the city, probably up in those redwood forests like you guessed. He doesn't want anyone finding her." The words sent a shockwave through Arthur. Cecilia was alive. After all these years, she was still out there. "Where is she?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling with urgency. Sal shook his head. "I don't know exactly, but I can point you in the right direction. There's a cabin up north, deep in Sonoma County, maybe even Mendocino. It's isolated, hard to get to. If Thorne is hiding her anywhere, it's there." Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They finally had a lead. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and now they were closer than ever to finding Cecilia. As they left the bar, Olivia looked up at Arthur, her face a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you think she's really there?" Arthur nodded, his voice steady. "I do. And we're going to bring her home." The cabin Sal Marino had told them about was tucked away in the dense redwood forest, a place so remote it felt like the edge of the world. Arthur, Olivia, and Mac had driven for hours through winding tree-lined roads, the landscape growing more primeval with each passing mile. The further they went, the more Arthur felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. This could be it. Cecilia could be just a few miles away, alive after all these years. Beside him, Olivia was quiet, her face pale and drawn. Arthur knew she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. She had been through so much already, discovering her true identity, learning about her mother's kidnapping, and now facing the possibility of reuniting with a woman she had never known. He could only imagine what was going through her mind, but he felt a responsibility to keep her strong, to protect her from whatever they might find. Mac had been quiet for most of the trip, his eyes fixed on the narrow road ahead. He was experienced in dealing with dangerous situations, but even he seemed uneasy about this one. Julian Thorne was not a man to be underestimated. If Thorne really was keeping Cecilia here, there was no telling what kind of security or defenses he had in place. As they pulled up to a narrow dirt track leading deeper into the woods, Mac cut the engine and turned to Arthur. "This is as close as we're going to get without being spotted," he said, his voice low. "From here we go on foot." Arthur nodded. "Let's do it." Olivia climbed out of the car without a word, her expression grim. Arthur noticed her hands shaking slightly, but when he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, she straightened her posture, forcing herself to remain calm. This was it. They were on the edge of finally discovering the truth. The three of them moved quietly through the towering trees, the sound of the wind sighing through the ancient branches the only noise around them. The cabin came into view just as Sal had described it. Small, isolated, and surrounded by the imposing silence of the redwood forest. It looked abandoned, but Arthur knew better. There was no way Thorne would leave Cecilia here unguarded. Mac motioned for them to stop as they reached a clearing just before the cabin. "I'll go ahead and check things out," he whispered. "Stay here and wait for my signal." Arthur nodded, watching as Mac slipped silently into the shadows, moving toward the cabin like a ghost. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel Olivia's tension growing beside him. "What if she's not here?" Olivia whispered, her voice filled with fear. "She's here," Arthur said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "We'll find her." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mac reappeared, signaling for them to follow. They crept through the trees and up to the edge of the cabin, where Mac pointed to a window on the side. "There's someone inside," he whispered. "I couldn't get a clear view, but it looks like a woman. She's alone." Arthur felt his heart leap in his chest. Could it be Cecilia? "Let's move," Arthur said, his voice filled with quiet determination. They made their way to the front door, and Mac carefully tried the handle. It was unlocked. With a quick nod to Arthur, Mac pushed the door open slowly, and they stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit, with sparse furniture and the faint musty smell of disuse hanging in the air. In the far corner of the room, a figure sat on a worn-out couch, her back to them. Arthur froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was a woman, her hair long and dark, just like Cecilia's had been. "Cecilia," Arthur called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman didn't move. Arthur's pulse raced as he stepped closer, his heart pounding louder with every step. He had waited for this moment for 20 years, had dreamed of it every night. But now that it was happening, he was terrified. What if she didn't remember him? What if she had been so broken by the years of captivity that she wasn't the same person he had loved? He reached out gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Cecilia," he said again, his voice trembling. Slowly, the woman turned to face him, and Arthur felt his knees go weak. It was her. It was Cecilia. Her face was thinner, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and pain, but it was her. The woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. "Arthur!" Cecilia's voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in years. She blinked up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "It's me," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "It's really me." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the years of separation, the pain, and the loss all swirling between them. Then, slowly, Cecilia's expression softened, and tears filled her eyes. "You came," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You found me." Arthur felt tears well up in his own eyes as he pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered into her hair. "I never gave up." Behind him, Olivia stood frozen in place, her eyes wide as she stared at the woman who had given her life. The mother she had never known was right in front of her, and yet the distance between them felt insurmountable. Arthur pulled back slightly, glancing over his shoulder at Olivia. "Cecilia," he said softly, "there's someone you need to meet." Cecilia looked past Arthur, her gaze landing on Olivia. For a moment, she didn't seem to understand. But then, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Olivia!" Cecilia whispered, her voice trembling. Olivia took a hesitant step forward, her face pale. "Mom!" she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. In an instant, Cecilia's face crumpled, and she reached out to her daughter, her hand shaking. "Oh my God! Olivia, my baby!" Olivia rushed forward, collapsing into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as years of pain and loneliness melted away in the warmth of her mother's embrace. For the first time in her life, Olivia wasn't alone. She had found her family. They had found each other. But even as the long-awaited reunion unfolded, a dark shadow still lingered in the back of Arthur's mind. Julian Thorne was still out there, and he wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The reunion between Cecilia and Olivia was as emotional as Arthur had anticipated. He watched as mother and daughter clung to each other, their tears flowing freely, releasing the years of grief and separation that had haunted both of them. But even as his heart swelled with relief and gratitude, Arthur couldn't shake the nagging sense of danger that lingered in the back of his mind. Julian Thorne was still out there, and Arthur knew the man well enough to understand that Thorne wouldn't let them walk away unscathed. After a few moments, Arthur gently pulled Olivia and Cecilia apart, his tone serious as he addressed them. "We have to go. Now." Cecilia looked up at him, her eyes still full of tears. "Arthur, how did you find me? I thought." Her voice broke and she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. "I never gave up," Arthur said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "But we're not safe yet. Thorne knows we're close. We need to get you out of here." Cecilia nodded, her face pale and worn from years of captivity. She stood slowly, her legs trembling slightly as she leaned on Arthur for support. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "You're stronger than you think," Arthur said, guiding her toward the door. "We'll get through this. Together." Mac, who had been standing guard near the cabin's entrance, motioned for them to move quickly. "We need to go now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not sure how much longer we have before Thorne figures out what's going on." Arthur nodded in agreement, helping Cecilia into the car as Olivia climbed into the back seat. Mac started the engine, and they sped off down the dirt track, leaving the cabin behind. The mountain roads were winding and treacherous, but Mac kept his focus, navigating the sharp turns with precision. The tension in the car was thick, the silence punctuated only by the occasional sound of the tires skidding on loose gravel. Arthur sat in the front seat, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They needed to get far away from Thorne, but more importantly, they needed to figure out how to stop him once and for all. As they drove deeper into the forest, Arthur noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights. His stomach dropped. "We've got company," he muttered, his voice tight. Mac glanced in the mirror, his expression darkening. "Damn it. They're on to us." Olivia turned in her seat, her eyes widening as she saw the headlights approaching quickly from behind. "What do we do?" "We keep moving," Mac said, his voice tense. "But if they catch up to us, things could get ugly." The car behind them sped up, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. Arthur clenched his fists, his mind racing as he considered their options. They were trapped on a narrow forest road, and it was only a matter of time before Thorne's men caught up. "We can't outrun them on these roads," Arthur said, his voice grim. "We need to find another way." "There's a turnoff up ahead," Mac replied, his eyes scanning the road. "It leads down to an old logging road. It's rough, but it might give us some cover." "Do it," Arthur said, his jaw clenched. Mac nodded, gripping the wheel tightly as he veered sharply to the right, taking the turnoff at the last second. The car bounced violently as they hit the uneven road, the headlights behind them momentarily disappearing into the trees. For a brief moment, Arthur allowed himself to hope that they might have lost their pursuers. But that hope was short-lived. The headlights reappeared, and the sound of roaring engines grew louder. "They're not giving up," Olivia said, her voice filled with fear. "Hold on," Mac growled, his knuckles white as he swerved the car down the narrow rocky path. The vehicle shook as they navigated the rough terrain, but Mac kept his foot on the gas, determined to keep them ahead of Thorne's men. The trees closed in around them, the darkness of the forest thickening as the road grew more treacherous. Arthur glanced at Cecilia, who sat in stunned silence, her eyes wide with fear. "It's going to be okay," Arthur said, trying to reassure her. "We're almost out of here." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The car behind them was gaining ground, and Arthur knew that a confrontation was inevitable. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, followed by the unmistakable sound of the car's back tire blowing out. The vehicle lurched violently to the side, and Max struggled to keep it under control. But it was too late. The car skidded off the road, crashing into the trees. "Everybody out!" Max shouted, his voice hoarse as he unbuckled his seat belt. Arthur and Olivia scrambled out of the car, helping Cecilia to her feet as Mac quickly assessed the damage. The car was stuck, the tire completely blown out, and the frame wedged against a tree. They were stranded. "We have to move," Mac said urgently. "They're right behind us." Arthur grabbed Cecilia's hand and pulled her into the trees, Olivia close behind them. The forest was thick and disorienting, but they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of Thorne's men. As they stumbled through the underbrush, the sound of footsteps and voices grew closer. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They were running out of time. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. Olivia screamed, ducking as the sound reverberated around them. "Go!" Arthur shouted, pushing Cecilia and Olivia forward. "Keep moving!" Another gunshot, and then the sound of footsteps getting closer. Arthur turned, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of their pursuers. He could hear them now, the low murmur of voices as they closed in. "We can't outrun them," Max said, panting as he caught up to Arthur. "We have to fight." Arthur's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But he knew Mac was right. They couldn't keep running forever. "Then we fight," Arthur said, his voice hard. "But we're not going down without a fight." The footsteps grew closer, the shadows shifting in the darkness. Arthur's pulse raced as he prepared himself for what was coming. This was it. The final confrontation. And he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his family. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crackling of twigs underfoot and the distant rustle of leaves. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, keeping Cecilia and Olivia behind him. The darkness surrounded them like a thick blanket, making it difficult to tell where Thorne's men were coming from. But the unmistakable sound of footsteps was closing in. Mac was beside him, his eyes sharp as he scanned the area, listening for any movement. They had no choice now but to face their enemies head-on. Arthur could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Years of searching, years of pain and loss, and now it all came to this moment. "We stick together," Arthur whispered to Mac. "We protect them at all costs." Mac gave a quick nod, his jaw clenched. "I'll take the front. You stay close to Cecilia and Olivia." Another gunshot echoed through the trees, the sound reverberating in the still night. Arthur's pulse quickened, his protective instincts kicking in. He crouched lower, pulling Cecilia and Olivia closer to him. "Stay down," he whispered urgently to them, his voice low and controlled. "Don't move until I say so." Cecilia's hand trembled in his, and he could see the fear etched on her face. But she nodded, trusting him implicitly. Olivia's face was pale, her wide eyes darting around as she tried to remain calm. Despite her fear, there was a strength in her that reminded Arthur of Cecilia. The same determination, the same will to survive. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the shadows ahead, and without hesitation, Mac lunged forward. He moved with precision, tackling the man to the ground before he had a chance to react. There was a brief struggle, and then the unmistakable sound of a gun clattering to the ground. Mac stood up, breathing heavily, his face set in grim determination. "They're coming," Mac muttered, his voice strained. "Get ready." Arthur tensed, his senses on high alert. He could hear more footsteps approaching, and he knew they were running out of time. The odds were stacked against them, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not after coming this far. As the shadows shifted, more figures emerged from the trees. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them. Julian Thorne. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes scanning the forest, his face twisted in a smug grin. Well, Thorne sneered, stepping forward slowly. "Arthur Sterling. Always so predictable." Arthur stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "It's over, Thorne," he growled. "Let her go. Let us all go." Thorne chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You really think you're in a position to make demands? After all these years, you're still the same. Always thinking you're in control. You have nothing left," Arthur said, his voice steady. "We found Cecilia. We know everything. There's nowhere left for you to hide." Thorne's eyes darkened, and he took another step forward, his hand hovering dangerously close to the gun tucked into his waistband. "You don't understand, Sterling. This isn't about hiding. This is about winning. And I always win." Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down the man who had stolen everything from him. This was the moment. It had all led to this. But even as Thorne sneered, Arthur knew that the fight wasn't about him anymore. It was about Cecilia, about Olivia, about protecting his family from the man who had tried to destroy them. "I'm not here to play your game anymore," Arthur said, his voice low and controlled. "This ends now." Without warning, Thorne drew his gun, his eyes filled with rage. Time seemed to slow as Arthur instinctively threw himself in front of Cecilia and Olivia, shielding them from the imminent danger. The sound of the gunshot pierced the air, and Arthur felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. He staggered, the world spinning around him, but he didn't fall. He wouldn't fall. "Dad!" Olivia screamed, rushing forward to help him. "I'm fine," Arthur gasped, his hand pressed against the wound. "Stay back." Mac, who had been waiting for the right moment, lunged at Thorne, tackling him to the ground before he could get another shot off. The two men struggled in the dirt, but Mac, fueled by years of loyalty and determination, managed to wrest the gun from Thorne's hand and toss it away. Thorne fought back, but Mac was relentless. Finally, with a swift, brutal punch, Mac knocked Thorne unconscious, leaving him lying motionless on the ground. The forest was silent again, the danger past. But the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Arthur sank to his knees, his breath ragged, the pain in his side throbbing with each pulse. Olivia was at his side in an instant, her hands trembling as she tried to help him. "You're hurt," she said, her voice thick with panic. "I'll be all right," Arthur said, though his voice was strained. He looked over at Cecilia, who stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. "It's over." Max stood over Thorne, breathing heavily. His eyes narrowed in disgust. "He won't be getting up anytime soon." Arthur nodded, his vision swimming slightly as the adrenaline started to wear off. He looked at Olivia and Cecilia, the two people he had fought so hard to protect, and despite the pain, a sense of peace settled over him. They had won. They had made it through the nightmare that Thorne had created for them. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting light over the forest, Arthur closed his eyes and let out a slow, relieved breath. It was finally over.